am hopping on live to continue Mindsight, which is a fantastic book. So if you're not reading along with me and just watching these videos, I would highly recommend grabbing it. I actually do this in audiobook form. It's my preferred learning method because it just works well for the type of learning that I do. But if it comes in both forms, so there's no excuse. Mindsight by Dr. Daniel Siegel. He's amazing. I use his work all the time with clients, both parenting clients and personal growth clients. I can't say enough fantastic things about him. And this book is pretty much, I would consider this kind of the Bible of personal growth if you want to talk about my own personal journey or how my mind thinks about mindset and neuroplasticity and how you grow and utilize these tools in the best possible way. So I can't be more thrilled than to share this with you. Chapter 2 is titled Crepes of Wrath, which basically he's doing a fantastic job with having an illustrative story to highlight what he's going to talk about. And then he talks about it, and then he goes into the actual brain functions and why they're important and how they relate to what he's done. So if you didn't catch the intro or the chapter 1, they are on my personal page, but they will be hard to find. So you can hop over to the business page or look at my YouTube channel, which is Best Self, Best Health. And they're all there by chapter. So I upload those at least once a week. So Radical Acceptance is on there. And then this will be Mindsight. So I'm sorry my hair is at that weird growth where it keeps popping in front of my face. So just ignore that. So Crepes of Wrath. This actually is a beautiful chapter. The story is a personal story of his. So he's talking about his own self. And there's a lot of things that go into this, but basically this is an example of a common thing that happens to every single person. It happens a lot in parenting, but it happens in your personal life too, whether that's, with a loved one, with a parent, with a friend, with a coworker. And it's this idea of how we get swept up into this situation. And oftentimes in our culture, especially, instead of taking responsibility and acknowledging what happened, we shame ourselves and then we ignore everything that happened. And the problem with that is you cannot grow from it, and you cannot repair, and you cannot make connections or move forward. So he says that when you learn to acknowledge an event that happened, you actually can repair damage, and you can learn to decrease the frequency and decrease the intensity of the type of meltdown that happened. Now, interestingly enough, that meltdown in this case is his own meltdown. You can also help children go through their meltdown. So I'll draw some parallels just because I talk about this a lot in my own work. So I guess I should recap the event for those of you who have read this and those of you who have not. He tells a really common story. He has a son and a daughter. They are coming home from some event or school. The son says he's hungry. Can we stop at the crepe shop? Of course, we can stop. He asks the daughter if she wants anything. No, I'm not hungry. Then, of course, when they sit down to eat, the daughter smells the food and it says, can I try a bite? The son, who only got one, looks down and was like, Dad asked you if you wanted to order your own. You should have ordered your own, right? So the parent, this case Dan, says, okay, she's like, I don't want to order a whole one. I only want a bite just to see if I even like it. He's thinking, oh, that sounds reasonable. He asks the son. The son is like, fine, and then cuts like the most minuscule piece, right? Just a sliver, barely could pick it up, puts it on her napkin, and she says, really? Like, that's too small to even taste. So now Dan, his anxiety and his own past experiences and emotions are building up, and he's getting irritated, and he looks at the son. He's like, really? Please just share one bite with your sister. So he reluctantly cuts off a bite and gives it to the sister. And the sister says, you gave me the burnt piece. So he kind of loses his cool and starts, right, yelling and punishing the son for not sharing. And it's kind of an emotional roller coaster. And I'm sure you all can relate to times when this has happened. So he goes through this and he says, the thing is, in the moment when there are lots of words for this. So Dan often calls it flipping your lid, because remember his hand model was like the brain and this is the cortex. And when you flip your lid, your cortex is offline. So it's just your limbic and your brain stem that's in control. I call that an amygdala hijack. You can call it whatever you want, but it basically means you're offline. When that happens, you are not functioning, and I'm going to talk about what happens in that moment. He wants to preface this with the fact that flipping your lid can be the result of multiple things happening at once, and I talk about this a lot with kids. So first of all, if you have a meltdown or someone you know is having a meltdown, there are probably basic needs that were not met: sleep, eating, they're stressed out, they don't feel the greatest, they're dehydrated, they're tired, all these things. Also, the meaning of the event also plays a role. And for older people, so I'm talking about, adults, there's a lot that gets triggered that we are not aware of that can play a major role in whether we can see the sides of a situation in clarity and keep our prefrontal cortex functioning as it is. Oftentimes what happens is there's this subconscious trigger that we're not aware of, and only upon reflection do we realize that it was even an issue for us. With kids, that happens as well, but they're less likely to understand that without help, and a lot of times they take a adult to help them piece this out. He then says we're going to target the middle prefrontal cortex, right, in this meltdown and talk about what really happened. Just remember that middle part of the cortex, right, that touches all the things, remember, that part is in control of balancing, right, the brain, and it is in control of regulating the other parts of the brain because it's the one that's connected to them. So when that goes offline, you're unable to regulate the lower limbic and brainstem areas, and your brain just gets disrupted. Okay. Now, also remember that usually results physically. The most that gets affected, like lots of stuff gets affected, but the breath, the heart rate, and the digestion are usually like keys in there. And he'll talk about that in a moment. He then goes through and says, all right, so just to illustrate the point, the prefrontal cortex, right, that is now offline, usually handles the U maps. And we talked about this in the previous chapter. In other words, my brain's ability to see you in context, understand where you're coming from, look at your perspective. That's gone, right? Can't see others. And you can't see their motivations. Also, my me maps from the first chapter are gone. In other words, I don't see myself in this situation. I am reacting usually off of emotions, sometimes off of habits, and I am not looking at myself or understanding myself in order to take a nice perspective or evaluation of the situation. And finally, the we maps, which would look at how you and I are interacting and what needs to happen. And really, the we maps would allow for a parent, in this case, to have an appropriate response. That's offline. It's gone. Prefrontal cortex does all that, and it's offline. The other crazy part is he says, and I can't even remember if I talked about all of this. I'm sure I did. But he goes through the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex, and he talks a little bit about how each of those are affected and how he can, in retrospect, go back and reflect on that in this situation. So 1 was bodily regulation, okay? This is where I talked about the digestive, where your belly can get upset, or, you start feeling your intestines churning, your breath starts getting shallow or rapid, your heart rate increases. This is also a sign that and if you've heard me speak, I talk about this, that your sympathetic nervous system has taken over. So your central nervous system, this again, prefrontal cortex controls the central nervous system. Central nervous system has 2 sides. It has the sympathetic and it has the parasympathetic. And if you follow me, I talk about this all the time, how to flip in between if one is taking over. They cannot happen at the same time. And that's really important to recognize and understand. I used to say in birthing, it's amazing. You can look at birthing and what happens between and how it switches back and forth between those 2 and why one can happen and while the other one cannot, right? So when you're in severe pain, you cannot have the other. So this is why people, when they're in pain, cannot regulate anything else, right? They're in this hijacked situation. And there are lots of ways that we can actually help get the parasympathetic back online, especially if you're talking about long-term damage. And I know I've talked about this on my own page with the pandemic, and now with war happening in Europe. There are a lot of stressors, and it's really easy to fall into what I call chronic stress situations, which push your body into your sympathetic nervous system taking over. All right. And that has lots of repercussions. Then he talks about 2 is attuned communication. And I think that's pretty obvious that when your prefrontal cortex is offline, you are not in tune with anyone. That attunement is what allows you to shift, right? It allows you to look at another person, to help the other person feel felt in a moment, and kind of align your state with the other person. You can also, I'm plugging my phone in because my phone is messaging me that it has low battery. So bear with me. When that happens and you're not attuned with someone else, it's really hard to respond appropriately or in a way that they are going to be open and receptive, because quite frankly, you are not open and receptive to what they're saying. Okay. Number 3 is emotional balance. Again, I think you all have felt this at one point in time. He relates this actually to 2 really cool concepts. If you've read any of his other books, Whole Brain Child, The Yes Brain, No Drama Discipline, he talks a lot about how your brain has 2 sides of it. And one is chaotic and one is rigid. And we kind of want to float on the river in between those 2 things. And here he talks about how when the prefrontal cortex is online, you're in the middle of those 2. There's a balance, right, of rigidity and chaos. And on the chaotic side, on the chaos side, what happens is you get too much arousal. When there's too much arousal in the brain, you tend towards this chaotic side, right? And when you have too little arousal, you end up in this rigid side, which you can think of as a depressive side, right? So the goal of the prefrontal cortex is to kind of keep you in the middle, not to say that you won't bounce from side to side, but that it aligns you to stay on that river. He also says that that kind of is the equanimity idea. The idea of staying balanced is really important. When your prefrontal cortex is offline, you have no ability to do that. You can't even see that you're in one side or the other. And sometimes you might catch yourself. Usually it's already after it has happened because you don't have that ability. All right. Number 4 is response flexibility. Again, prefrontal cortex driven. So I actually talk about this a lot with parents, right? Now he's talking about himself in this situation. He's really actually lucky that it was him and not one of the kids that really went offline in this whole situation. Like they bantered and they obviously were irritated with each other, but they didn't seem to go into a full meltdown like he did, right? What happens when that happens is you have no ability to pause, right? So those flexible responses are when the prefrontal cortex gives us the ability to pause in our thinking and our actions. And it's one of the joys of mindfulness. So I celebrate wins with my clients all the time. And I say to them that the ability to pause is the first step, right? We may not be able to stop ourselves in this situation. However, we can absolutely recognize it. And if you can pause, that's the first step, recognizing and then pausing, right? So I guess that's 2 steps. All right, number 5, fear modulation. Again, in children, it's a little bit more easy to see, but when you're overcome with fear, right? You have this like inability to calm yourself. When the prefrontal cortex is offline, you have no ability to calm yourself. You don't have this modulation. When the prefrontal cortex is online, you actually are able to release GABA hormones, which actually go in and calm down fear, right? If you're not in control, right, at that, and your prefrontal cortex is off, there's no modulation of that fear. It's very different in children than in adults, because in adults, like he was talking in this situation, his fear, right, really was stemming from a past memory in his own issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that further. But basically, he said, I recognized after the fact that what had kind of triggered him was the fact that when he was little, he was the younger brother, and his older brother, you know, sometimes they had a great relationship, but there was a period of time where he was really feeling hurt by his older brother for not including him and not sharing. And it caused him to have these kind of little damages that he was not consciously aware of. In fact, he said, I'm really great friends with my brother now, and we joke about those times. But the fact is, when he kind of acknowledged what had happened in his own brain and went back and understood, it was that fear that was happening to his kids. And that was something that he had never, you know, he had always wanted to avoid. I want to make sure that my kids never feel that way towards each other. So he ended up reacting out of fear and not being able to modulate it at all. All right. This is fun. Isn't it so cool to like look at that? I just think this is so cool. All right. 6 is empathy. I talk about this a lot with parents and kids. You don't have empathy when your prefrontal cortex is not functioning. When you are offline, when you are hijacked, when you are, some people call it the red zone, when you have flipped your lid, there is no, Dan says, UMAP to look at the other person and being able to get into their point of view and understand it and have empathy. There is none of that. It does not happen without the prefrontal cortex. Number 7 is insight, which is the me maps, which means you're perceiving your own mind, both in the past, present, and possibly in the future. You have no ability to map that out when your prefrontal cortex isn't functioning correctly. Number 8 is moral awareness. This, again, I talk about this a lot with kids. Basically, the prefrontal cortex allows you to pick what's the best social good. It's really about allowing you to have the overall ability to look at an action, override your immediate impulse, and create an action that is actually does the most good. Now, I'm going to put in a caveat. This is not Dan, this is Jen. However, I want to put in a caveat that the prefrontal cortex is not fully formed until the mid-20s. And I talk a lot with parents and caregivers and step parents. I've even talked with the person at the corner store about teenagers. And one of the most frustrating things with teenagers is we tend to look at them as adults in many ways. Most of the time, they're the same size as us. They sound the same as us. And then we have these unrealistic expectations of them that they function like us. And one of the things that you can see almost universally with teenagers and young adults is this part of the prefrontal cortex, which is that moral judgment, that moral awareness. It's not fully there yet. So in other words, what happens is they can use their prefrontal cortex in many ways. But one of the I think one of the hardest things for them is being able to put it into a context where they can think about and draw out the you maps, me maps, and we maps, as Dan would say, and then make a judgment that is the most social good. They don't think that way. In fact, they almost always have an issue with impulse control. It's like, it sounds really good. They might think about it for a little bit and then just do it. And I think in general, our culture punishes them in a way that's almost unfair because it's not even like they have all the tools to fully do that yet. I'm not saying they don't have responsibility, but I'm saying it is good to be aware that your expectations may not be quite there if you're expecting them to act like you would act in the situation, because that prefrontal cortex is just in a different place. All right. That was my caveat that I'll leave then and there. All right. And the last one is intuition. So this is the part of the prefrontal cortex that has access to the gut feelings. And this is a really interesting one because he makes a point to say, in the moment, if you would have asked me, I would have defended myself because the prefrontal cortex, remember, is offline. And I would have said, my gut instinct was to make him share with his sister. That's not intuition. Intuition is when you are totally aware and aligned with all the parts of your body, right? Because we talk a lot about embodiment, and he'll talk about that actually in the next part. How that your brain is actually embodied and it's connected to your entire body. So there is a part, and if you haven't read The Gift of Fear, that's a great book that talks almost solely about your connection to your body and your brain and how you can really hone in on insight to be aware of dangers that are not really, what do I want to say, like obvious. But you hear all the time, I listen to my gut, right? So this is not to say that we want to draw a differential line here, that there is gut instinct and there is rationalizing that, oh, well, my instinct is to always protect the younger brother or whatever. that would be a rationalization and not the actual insight where you've taken the time to be and think within your body and pay attention to it. So that's kind of what happened in his brain. Those things all went offline. He had this inability. And this is what I will say. This happens all the time. This happens with every relationship you will have. And I loved that Dan was able to say this. What do you do? So, I mean, that's probably got to be the biggest question I get, at least as a parent coach. What do I do in the situation when my kid is flipping out? All right. In the situation, or that I'm flipping out and I feel like I'm out of control, right? The biggest thing we can do is recognize that it's happening. So even in his situation, he didn't realize till well beyond that it was happening, right? He had already dealt out punishments, yelled, right? Was really like trying to bully his son into doing this thing. And it wasn't until like after all of that, he really realized I might not be reacting rationally to the situation, right? Like something else is going on. So I always really promote mindfulness because it allows you the awareness to recognize that it's happening. Then end it as soon as possible. If you can stop yourself. Now, if you can stop yourself and it means, so for me, if that was happening and I found myself in an argument with my kid where I was like, just give him the thing. No, I don't want to give him the thing. Why do you have, why are you being selfish? Just give him the thing, right? If I find myself and I recognize it, I stop. And if I can't stop myself, if like my kid is pushing to keep going, I might even say, I need to just take a break. I'm realizing like I'm way beyond. I'm going to go to the bathroom, wash my hands, whatever it might be. I'm going to step outside. Sometimes I have to like walk away for a little period of time to stop. That means I'm not engaging with them and I'm going to allow myself that space, right? To bring myself back online. And then the third thing that he really makes an important point to say is it's really important that you make a repair to the relationship. So that's something else that I talk about a lot. You should never, ever, 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 ever be afraid to say you're sorry, especially if you are an adult and you are talking about this with a child. Whether you are a teacher, whether you are a little league coach, it's okay to acknowledge that you didn't handle something correctly because we're human. And he makes this point too, which is quite beautiful, about being human and therefore being fallible. Like we are not perfect creatures. We will never be perfect creatures. We can only strive to better ourselves. And those three things, recognizing that it's happening and putting an end to it as quickly as you can, that is a win. Because if your kids were able to do that, you would be blown away. And then later on, making sure you're in a calm state and making a repair, however you need to make that repair. My caveat in here would be, if you are the parent and you're helping to co-regulate your kid through this journey, it's not forcing a repair. So I think when we do it, we can model open, receptive, and heartfelt repair. And I think that's really important. All right. So the last part that he talks about is what he calls triangle of reflection. And Dan, he's amazing because he loves to have these visuals. So if you think about Mindsight as a camera, and it's on this little tripod, right? And the tripod has 3 legs. You could think of these 3 legs that hold Mindsight steady, right? That balance it as openness, observation, and objectivity. And so those 3 things are really, when we get back in touch with those, allows us to take that break and to get into the Mindsight of the situation. So I'm just going to briefly go over those 3 things. And openness, he says, is really being receptive to things that come into the consciousness and not clinging to preconceived ideas. If you've heard me speak before, I say you have to learn to accept things and not expect things. And I have said this over and over again in any of my other lives. Expectations need to go away. You should never enter a situation where you are expecting certain things to happen because you are dooming the situation to where it is. You really have to be open and have that openness to what is going to happen, and as those things come in, how they're kind of fitting in and where they're coming from. When we are letting go of expectations, we can really receive things as they are, and you can sense things clearly. You cannot do that if you had expectations in your head. And let me be clear that we all have them. So it's part of mindfulness to be aware that we have them and let them go. Like literally, you have to do the work to let them go. And then you can be open and sense things clearly. So I'm a big believer in this one aspect of openness. The second one is observation. And basically, this is the idea to perceive yourself within a situation. You can put yourself into the larger framework. I call this perspective. He calls it observation. But I often tell people, when you look at one side, or you let your lid is flipped, sometimes when we look back at the situation and we can't be open about it, we also can't be observing ourselves in that situation clearly. Like we're stuck in that we were that big bad person or whatever it be. And, we have guilt associated with that and shame associated with that. So it's really hard for us to let go and actually just observe where we were in the larger framework. That gives perspective moment to moment, right? Where am I in this situation? Oftentimes as a mom of spirited children, I have 4 children. I'd consider 2 of them very spirited children. One of the most difficult things is when I find myself in the situation and I become aware that I'm not in a good place in this situation, is observing myself. What is my place in this situation? And I don't need to be arguing, why am I engaging in this argument that's a power struggle when it actually has nothing to do with me, right? My perspective is instead to be there and kind of guide my child through the situation. And sometimes it's hard to do that, especially if our mindsight is off kilter. So it also allows us to let go and stop the cycle of habitual responses. Sometimes people, wherever you are on your journey, realize that a large percentage of the time we react in a way that we don't like, but it's out of habit. Oftentimes it is mimicking things that have happened in our past. Oftentimes we react as our parents have reacted or our teachers reacted, and we don't even quite understand why, but it's a habitual response that we wired into our brain. So we can actually learn to change that through proper observation. And the third thing is objectivity, which this allows thoughts and feelings to occur but not get swept up in them. It's a big one. In other words, everything that's happening, right? Your attention, what you're paying attention to, what memories are coming up, what thoughts, what feelings, they're temporary. In my Buddhist reading, we would say, nothing is permanent. So recognizing that this is impermanent and it will pass is important. Also, not tying it up with something that's not true. In other words, this behavior, this thought, this feeling, this moment, is is not temporary. And B does not mean that we're this person, that you're this bad mom, that your kid is this monstrous person, right? Because they're responding this way. It does not mean that. It absolutely does not mean that. It does not make us who we are, because it's not our identity. It is simply a temporary state that we're in, right? That's objectivity. And he talks a little bit about discernment, in which he says that thoughts and feelings are mental activity and not absolute reality, which is really, he gets into this meta that part of mindsight is being aware of awareness. So I'm excited to see how deep that goes and if he talks a little bit more. I won't go into tons of that. But it's true that the understanding that those things are happening in our brain, there is a part of us that needs to be aware that just because you had the thought doesn't mean A, that you're ever going to act on that thought. And B, we don't know where that thought came in. So you can't attribute that to a flaw in your personality. And I would say, if you want to see where that goes, you can look at some of the bases of psychology and Freud, right? Like trying to say, oh, you had this one thought, so that must mean that this happened, or recovered memories even. The psychology behind that, and the fact that you have these thoughts that come in that are muddled by other things. The fact is that they are not the absolute reality. They are mental activity that has been spawned and influenced by other things. It's pretty cool. Okay. You must have mindsight to recognize and repair and take responsibility. So his final part of this story was that upon reflection of his own behaviors, thoughts, and actions, he went to both of his kids and kind of reconnected with them and talked about the situation. Now, this doesn't mean you dump all of your issues onto the other person, but it does also mean you're a little bit vulnerable, take responsibility, and open up to them so that they understand your point of view, because you're actually modeling for them what they can do in the future. So he says you really have to recognize the shame and guilt, and then be kind and compassionate to yourself. That little piece right there, he goes very quickly over that, but I have to tell you that I can spend weeks and months with clients on learning self-compassion fully. And to be honest, you have to practice it, because it's the first thing that's easy to let go away. And I myself struggle with it, because you cannot be completely compassionate and kind to others if you cannot be kind and compassionate to yourself. And that's just how it goes. So first, you have to reconnect to yourself. You have to take your sympathetic nervous system, get your parasympathetic nervous system back. You have to calm yourself down. You have to do some reflection. And then you have to say to yourself, woo, you may not have handled that well, and that's okay. Where did that come from? You're human. Let's figure that all out, right? Do some internal reflection, and then shift to repairing whatever damage you would have done with somebody else. So he goes through, I think it's important that you ask if the other person is in a place that you can talk about it, and not be stuck that it has to happen in that moment. Because just because you're calm doesn't mean the other person is calm. So part of that compassion and empathy and being in a good place is making sure they're in that same good place. And also have a reflective dialogue. And it's really interesting when he talks about the conversations where, like, his daughter he opened up why he did what he did. And his daughter was like, well, that's your issue, not our issue. So true. It is my issue. And subconsciously it popped up and I wasn't even aware of it. So now that I'm aware of it, I can make sure that I have awareness around that the next time I'm in a similar situation, to really make sure I hone in and don't react habitually or based off of that, right? Fear that has happened in the past. He also talks about in this repair that it's really important not to judge who was right. That's another thing. It's so funny. He says that in one sentence, and for me, you could spend months learning how to let go of judgments. And in fact, I think Radical Acceptance, the other book that I have done these lives for, talks a lot about letting go of judgments, both for yourself and for others. So it is, when you go to repair your connection to somebody else, it is not about saying, and I was right or you were right. It's not about that. It's about being open to the other person, accepting however the other person was, and reflecting on where you are now. And sometimes it's even about recognizing that that repair and reconnect is not about you, right? It's not about whether you were right or whether you need them to understand every little bit, that went in. It's about saying, hey, I did not handle myself well. I'm apologizing to you. I recognize I flipped my lid for sure. I realize now that comes from a weird place, right? Like from my own experiences, and it really had nothing to do with you, and that was not fair to you. How are you feeling about it? And then that reflective listening skills and nonviolent communication is really, really important, because that helps you reconnect and repair, and it's honest, and it's not a forced fake apology, by the way, which children and adults recognize very readily and don't take well, right? If you're just like, I'm sorry, that means nothing to them if you're not ready to actually repair or take responsibility for your part. All right. He ends that with saying that we're human, we're fallible, and really Mindsight is not about perfection, but about honesty and humility. Which I love every bit of that. I think you could relate that to so many things. All right, I won't go on. I love that. He also has a quote from one of his mentors who said, uncovering memory and meaning are never over. In other words, this is a practice you're going to do over and over in your life. Like, it's just part of life. That's part of living as a human, right? As a moral human being. Okay. Part 2. So the cool thing is he breaks these chapters into like part 1 and part 2. That was part 1. Part 2 is that minding of the brain part. And here he's talking about neuroplasticity, which, made all the headlines because it meant that our brains were really malleable, that we could change our brains, that we weren't stuck in the same way. And neuroplasticity research is fantastic. I would also encourage people to look at Mindset, because I think that has a huge role to play in how you can take advantage of neuroplasticity. And there's lots of research on that he doesn't talk about that, or maybe he will in the future, but not in this chapter. He talks about the neurons, how there's 10,000 connections per neuron, which blows my mind. That the synaptic connections and possibilities of how you react to any one thing was measured to be 10 to the 1 millionth power. That's 10 times 10 a million times. That's more than the atoms in the universe. The possibilities in your brain are more than the atoms in the universe. That's crazy and amazing. Also, what they look for in a lot of neuroscience is patterns when they look at MRIs of the brain, when they look at how behavior or events have happened or what's going on with injuries. A lot of times they're looking at patterns, like what's lighting up in a certain area. You can actually change the shape of the firing and the shape of the structure of the brain itself through Mindsight techniques, which are mindfulness techniques. We know this. It's been proven through many, many, many scientific papers. I should look, because I'm listening to the audio, I haven't looked in the appendices yet, but I would imagine that he will have a list in the appendices he does of his other books of either book references or paper references of the things he's talking about, which are vast. Here he also wants to make a really big point that the brain and the mind are a little bit different, that the brain is embodied, which means that its neurons touch all over the body. It's not just your brain inside your head. And that it goes both ways. Brain to mind to brain, back and forth all around. It's not a one-way street. So mental activity stimulates brain firing as much as brain firing stimulates mental activity. And he really says that the key to this is focusing attention, because the studies show that when you can focus attention, you build connections and you can change the circuitry and rebuild certain areas. So it's really about using that insight, right? That focusing attention is what allows us to tap into neuroplasticity. He says the quote, "What fires together wires together." So he relates this to experience. So you have an experience, and when you have that experience, neurons activate, okay? And they start to fire. And when they fire, they touch other neurons, and that firing can either activate or deactivate the next neuron, right? So that leads to synaptic connections, and you can strengthen or lessen synaptic connections. And that leads to repetition, emotional arousal, novelty, and focused attention. And that's how we learn from experiences. That's kind of like the little pathway. He also mentions, and I love this, that temperament is actually genetic and not something you're in control of. So, and I relate this to another amazing author and Dr. Ross Greene, who wrote Raising Human Beings and The Explosive Child, and works endlessly with communities trying to instill collaborative, proactive solutions, which is his way to deal with children who, well, actually anyone who has unresolved problems. All right. So I say one of the greatest things I ever heard him say was, he's a father of 2 kids and neither of them is explosive. And what does it make him? Lucky. Doesn't make him a great father. It really makes him lucky. He's really lucky that the temperament of his children are not that. And that's very hard to accept when you have a spirited child, as a mom of spirited children. It really is. It's really rough. And I know it very well. But to understand that temperament is genetic, it's before they're born. It, however, is influenced by experiences. And then the experiences plus the temperament is what ultimately leads to personality. Okay? And transformation is always possible. So that's really interesting, because learning to focus attention in therapeutic ways can override old experience. So if you had a terrifying experience, this was his example, where you were bit by a dog, right? And so you have a naturally shy personality or a shy temperament anyways. That plus this experience when you see a dog might have you avoiding, running in the opposite direction. You can actually go through and transform that part of your personality, because it's not just your temperament. It is influenced by experience, and we can actually change that because we know that we can change the brain. Experience continually changes structures in the brain to either strengthen or create new pathways. I mean, that's the most amazing thing. When you have injuries that damage certain parts of the brain, you can actually rewire in other parts of the brain, which is amazing. And that's a whole nother book. And it equals a more adaptive mind. And finally, he ends this by saying, the brain is affected by the whole body, not just what's inside the skull. It's an embodied system, and neuroplasticity equals repaired, damaged connections and new pathways. So I also love the fact that he talks about embodiment, because I think we oftentimes ignore that. We say, oh, it's something in my brain. And then we ignore that, well, your brain is connected and all over your body. So I love that he kind of threw that in at the end. I probably could speak endlessly about that, but we know that that is a truth that is connected. And there's some really cool books, depending on how this goes, that we might look at, like The Body Keeps Score. There are tons of things about embodiment by Peter Levine, who's like, I consider one of the godfathers of embodiment and trauma, and that we hold a lot of stuff inside our bodies as well. And sometimes it comes out in weird tics or pain or chronic stuff that we don't realize. So there are also ways that we can work not only on our mind, but on our body as well. So that's chapter 2, and I hope you enjoyed. If you have questions, I know these are a little bit longer than the radical acceptance ones, because these are big chapters. So if you have questions or need to start a discussion or something wasn't clear, please post below, or go to my YouTube and start a discussion there. And I will see you next week with chapter 3.